All right, so this week we're going to just kind of give an introduction of the class as well as government. So there is some specific information on state and local, especially in the chapter. I'm going to cover a little bit in this video as well. As you hopefully have saw from the requirements for this week, I'm just asking you to skim through chapter one. So the textbook we're using is a free online resource, online textbook, which is why I chose it, but it's really our only option for that. So there's some things I really like and some things I don't like as much. So if you see skim, you probably know that's a chapter I'm not as thrilled with everything in it, but there's still some good information in it. So kind of focus on the parts of the chapter that talk about what state and local government do, as well as some of the issues that state and local government are facing. And then what I generally do in this first week as well is kind of give you more of a high level overview. So if you haven't had an American government class recently, kind of giving you that broader perspective because it helps you tie everything together. So just as a preparation, since this is our first video of the week, so what I usually recommend, even on the chapters where I want you to read a little more carefully, is maybe just kind of skim through fairly quickly, but do try to look over the textbook first, and then come and watch my videos. You'll see my videos don't just mirror the textbooks. They're not just like a repeat of what you've read. I'm always going to either be expanding or adding to what you've read. And you'll see, especially in today's video, it's going to be both of those. I'm not really going to repeat anything that's in that first chapter. So do look through it. And like I said, focusing on what the government, state and local government does. And again, you'll have an opportunity to talk about that in your discussion post as well this week. So, in kind of keeping in mind what I mentioned about the textbook, not necessarily, just keep in mind with politics, right? There's a lot of different perspectives, a lot of different opinions, and there are facts. There are the rights and the wrongs, like facts that aren't changed, but a lot of what we're going to talk about is really based on your perspective and your opinion. And so that's kind of why I just want to talk, just making sure you're always being kind of reading critically, but also thinking through from beyond your own perspective. So there are a couple of videos here that help in that if you haven't really gone over those and talked and kind of looked through that, some like having good logical arguments. And then I like these two cartoons, the one on the left, because it really just shows that reality really depends on how you view reality really depends on where you're standing and what you're looking, right? So your perspective of what's going on in the world is based on where you are. And so that's always a good reminder and try to see things from other people's perspectives as well. And then the cartoon on the right is that like bad logic, right? So just making sure you're not when it's really obvious like that, right? Things that we know to be not true, it's more obvious to see the logic. So the illogic in it, it's a little less hard when we don't actually know. But a lot of times these types of arguments, if we were really to step back and kind of view the arguments, they're almost as ridiculous as the one on the right when it comes to a lot of things in politics. So we just want to be cautious and careful that we're making good logical arguments, and we're not using logical fallacies, or again, letting our opinions or our perspectives override what's actual fact, and trying to make something that's not fact as if it were fact. So again, facts are things that are easy to prove. Anything that's not that we can't just prove easily, it's an opinion or a perspective, and it may or may not be true, and it may or may not be true depending on other circumstances and things going on. So along with that, again, in the whole like making sure that you have good logic, making sure you understand the difference between correlation and causation. And again, I think one of those the videos on that previous slide, if you go to the slides, will kind of explain this in a lot more detail. There's actually a very interesting study that was done, or idea that was done, where at one point they believed that ice cream caused polio, which we know is not the case, but there was just because there was a correlation that they both tend to happen or be experienced in heat, right? So heat, we tend to have ice cream when it's warm out, and polio tends to manifest, or the symptoms seem to come out more when it's warm. So a correlation just means that two things are connected. One may or may not be the cause of the other. Causation is actually very hard to show. And so most of the time we're talking about correlations between ideas. So we want to make sure we never like try to say something's that is just proven to be correlated is actually causing that one thing's not causing something else. So just kind of keep that in mind, again, going along with that logic, that you just have to be very cautious in your arguments and just thinking through. And again, feel free to call out things you might see in the textbook, because even professors who write textbooks are not infallible. In addition, it's important to think about what is politics, right? We think of government and politics as interchangeable, but they are very different. things. So I really like this quote from Harold Laswell. Politics is deciding who gets what, when, and how. So politics is sort of the how and the decision-making process, and then government's the one actually carrying out those decisions. Right? As a result, government and politics is going to be very messy. Just look around at state, local, or federal government, and it's very easy to tell that. No government's perfect, right? So as you look out there, there's no perfect governments, and no one's exactly happy with what's going on at any time with most governments, right? Because there's this competing and balancing of ideas and beliefs. There's always winners and losers, deciding, whose beliefs, whose ideas, whose wants, and even whose needs are going to be met by a limited supply of that the government can do. In addition, it's also a good idea to keep in mind that as the governments are created, it's sort of this give and take. And so governments are going to necessarily limit personal liberty. By deciding to have a government, you're choosing to limit some of your personal liberty because you now have somebody telling you what you can and cannot do. But the trade-off is that the government should also be protecting your personal liberty. And we'll talk about more of this when we get into the next couple of chapters with federalism and the Constitution. But I just sort of wanted to introduce this concept and start thinking about it, right? So as the government's making these decisions, it's deciding whose and what personal liberties are going to be limited and whose and what personal liberties are going to be protected. To keep in mind as we look at government and just sort of decisions that are made is this sort of tension that we exist within the U.S. government at the national level from the founding and the states as well, right? On the one side, you have this fear of mob rule and fear of the masses, and right, James Madison writes, right, the abuse of power by the majority trampling on the rights of the minority. But at the same time, you have like our U.S. Constitution, which starts "We the people," right? And Lincoln said it's a government of the people, by the people, for the people. So you sort of have this tension going on in government between the government is ran or for the people, but at the same time, we also want to protect it from the people. So just kind of keep that in mind as we kind of talk about the different types of governments we see at the state level and some of the options that they have available to kind of choose from. I just really like this quote, and I just think it's a good one to kind of think about. And again, this is one of those where you can agree or disagree. But Gary Wills wrote, "Our very liberty depends so heavily on a distrust of government that the government itself, we are constantly told, was constructed to instill that distrust." So again, as we're thinking about how state governments are structured, kind of how they kind of match the federal government, and just some of the choices on rules and powers, then how they're distributed, just kind of keeping this quote in mind and thinking about it throughout the semester. And whether or not you agree or disagree, does it vary from state to state? All right, so that sort of takes us into where this chapter is really getting into, and that's getting us down to the state and local level. So American people are a very diverse population, and that's one of our main characteristics that distinguishes us from a lot of other countries is our diversity. We have a diversity in immigration, religion, identity, economics, culture. And so I think it's kind of fitting that our national motto is E pluribus unum. So out of many, one, right? So out of all of these differences, this diversity of who we are, we have this commonality. We have shared interests. We have shared beliefs. So, and that gets us to these core American values, right? They're all based on individual liberties that are perceived as natural rights from the Constitution. And again, we'll hit on this more, but hopefully you have some background or some knowledge on the U.S. Constitution and this idea of natural rights that's found both in the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution and most state constitutions for that matter, right? It's this belief in individual freedom that, a free human has these natural rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they kind of can be tied into these 5 different sort of like overarching main values that most people in the United States that consider themselves Americans share. The idea of popular sovereignty, majority rule, minority rights, economic rights, and political equality. We're not going to necessarily get into these in detail, but if you want to, feel free to ask me if you have any questions about what each one of these means if you haven't heard or seen these ideas or concepts before. Right, so all of this ties into
what's known as Locke's social contract. And again, this is pulling in from outside, so hopefully you've seen this in some other classes, in a previous class that you've taken, right? Locke's social contract, that we transfer some of our power to the government there, and that naturally incurs some inconveniences for us, but the trade-off is that we get some securities and protection. And so really what the decision and the deciding factor here, and often the disagreement between different factions and different groups in the United States, is what's acceptable. How much power is acceptable to give to the government, and how much security and protection do we expect the government to give. And this is where most disagreements between people from different ideologies, different perspectives, different beliefs comes from, is this difference in how much and what, right? Which rights are we willing to give up? Which securities, which protections do we expect from the government, and which do we expect to maintain and retain as individuals? And so while we all sort of agree on this idea of Locke's social contract, that we're giving up some of our power in exchange, we're getting security, we don't necessarily agree. And even all the way back at the founding of the country, right, the debates over the Constitution were really the same arguments over how much, what kind of rights, and what are we willing to do, and what do we expect in return? What should we expect in return from the government? All right, we're going to talk more about political parties and interests later in this semester, but I do want to kind of just introduce political ideologies, which is different than political parties. And so these are sort of the four main ones that sort of developed within the United States. And again, it's sort of this basis on whether you want more economic rights, less economic restrictions, more social equality, less restrictions by the government, more individual freedoms. That kind of depends on which quadrant, which square you put in. There's lots of different variations of this, but of course you can kind of break people off into different quadrants, and then again, where they land within those quadrants will also be different, right? On how strongly they feel about each of those. You could have someone up in a far left corner and then someone down in the bottom right corner. Those would be they would even be different within those different ideologies. So there's a lot of variation, there's a lot of differences, and it's fairly complex. All right, and another way of thinking about ideology, and this is a little bit different, this is kind of gets us back to that state and local government sort of idea, is Elazar's 3 types of political cultures, which the chapter talks about, but there's also a handout that you'll find in as a resource if you need more information or kind of want to break down these a little bit more, because don't get too hung up on the terms. Really look at the definition. Think about people you might know from some of the states listed. And again, if you've been outside the state or know people from other states, if you've lived outside of the state, right, maybe some differences between them. So his 3 are moralistic, traditionalistic, and individualistic. So the moralistic ones really are about achieving the common good. You find this a lot in the northwestern portion of the country. Traditionalistic, it really thinks of government as being run by elites, and it's really meant to protect the elites. You find this more down in the south. And then individualistic states believe that government's meant to just help them achieve their individualistic goals. And for the most part, they ignore government regulations and what they're doing until the government oversteps or steps on what they perceive as their individual liberties. And Illinois actually does fall into this category.
A lot of time on this. This is actually someone who took Elazar's work and then basically kind of extended it out as things have happened and people have shifted, and kind of, so you'll see that some states actually have 2, so like a dominant and a subdominant, a sub cultural trait there. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time. This is on the slides if you want to kind of go out and look, especially for your state project, kind of look and see what your state culture, political culture is kind of viewed as, read through it, and kind of do it. It's kind of interesting to see like kind of how that fits in, and if you really, if it fits with what you think you're learning. But it does help to kind of have an idea, because again, governments will operate differently based on the political culture of the population.
So this is the original work by Elazar. So if you're kind of curious where all of the estates originally landed in, I couldn't find a good map, but this lays out and reads them, so you can find all 50 states on here. And as I mentioned already, Illinois fits within that individualistic category. So what does this mean? What does that actually play out? So I'm going to kind of show you some maps that I have that I think are a good representation. So this you see is the 2016 election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And you can see the breakdown of the states by electoral college vote. So, right, who won each state, red versus blue. And you can see that broken down. Right, but as you can see, that only tells part of the story, as this map then further breaks it down by county, right? So each county is now marked as either blue or red, and they're also shaded, either darker blue for if the more they voted for Hillary Clinton, darker red if they had a higher percentage voting for Donald Trump. And then this is what happens if you just sort of do a gradient analysis of them. So not breaking it up by any sort of actual unit, but just looking at the population in general, right? We get a lot of this purple. There's a few, red areas sort of in the middle that are a little bit wrong, but most of it's kind of this purple or orangish color, right? It's a mixture. So that means that even though we often divide states up, red versus blue, the story is actually more complicated when you break things down at a more local level. Similarly, I like this example of the of Illinois, looking at the state of Illinois. So I've pulled out the 2010 and the 2014. So in 2010, Governor Quinn actually won 47 to 46%. And then in 2014, there on the right-hand side, Governor Ronner actually won a 50 to 46%. And so you can see just the slight differences. And again, I'll post these slides so the picture's not covering up those southern states, but you can really kind of just compare, right? A few changes of votes here or there in different counties in Illinois made a pretty substantial difference in the outcome of the governor's race. All right, and since we will be looking at all states, but since we're in the state of Illinois, I'm going to kind of highlight some things about Illinois as we go through. So Illinois is often looked at or divided up into these three sort of segments. So you've got Chicago, the suburbs, and then downstate. So, right, so just another way of sort of maybe breaking up or looking at the state and different things. So just kind of keep that in mind as we're looking or working at different examples using Illinois.
To hit on a couple of things that these are areas where normally in the state and local government textbook you see this, and maybe they do get, and I just kind of missed it in later chapters, or they put it in a different chapter than what I was looking for it at. But a couple of things to keep in mind. There's something known as the comparative method, and that's basically comparing from state to state. And generally when you're comparing, right, you want to compare state to state, or maybe like a city to a city, an urban area to an urban area. So that's what the comparative method is, right? It's looking at similar units and then comparing them to kind of see what's similar, what's different. And often that's used to decide if certain policies are effective or not effective. Also keeping in mind, right, that we just, as I mentioned with the political cultures, right, we have 50 states. There are, even though they may be listed in the same like bucket as far as a political culture, there's differences. No two states are exactly the same. They have different cultures, different beliefs, different perspectives from within that state because they have different forces within the state, right? That's pushing them. A rural agricultural state is going to have different needs than a small metropolitan state that maybe is on the coast. Another thing to keep in mind is what this idea of known as laboratories of democracy. And so this is just this idea that it's better to try things in a smaller unit, whether it's a local unit or even states, than it is to try it across the whole entire United States, mostly because as you'll find out, it's easier to change laws at the state or local level. And if it doesn't go right or it doesn't go well, it's easier to reverse it, and then you haven't kind of screwed up everybody, right? Just that local area. But states and local governments are more likely to reverse and change things if something goes wrong. If you pay any attention to our federal government, right, things that get passed, even when they're not good, they tend to get unfunded, but don't necessarily ever 100% go away. And then there's this other concept of de-evolution, which is just the idea of moving things from the from control of the federal government back to the states. And we're definitely been seeing a shift of that. We've been seeing it for the last couple of decades, but definitely kind of like sped up in the last few years, especially in President Trump's first term, and then we can possibly never know, expect to see that more in his second term. But again, de-evolution is kind of that idea of just giving administration, giving control back to the states.
All right, a couple of last slides to sort of bring this point home. So these are some great slides that I think really help. So this compares our U.S. states to countries based on our GDPs. So gross domestic product, so how much money basically the states are kind of bringing in. So you can kind of compare what the states are in size. So their economies essentially, all of our states' economies can be compared to another country. I mean, that's the state. So again, that's the idea of thinking of things at maybe the more local level as opposed to the national level, because, and why things don't work here in the United States that sometimes can work in other countries. Well, because a lot of our states are the same size as a lot of those other countries that comparing. So just one of our states can often equal the country, one of the country we're trying to compare our policies and our regulations to. Right, and another one, similarly, and let you give you guys a chance when you look at the slides, you can kind of use these compare the states based on population. So again, another variation. So the first one looks at economy. This compares state populations to populations of other countries. All right, and so sort of the last thing kind of highlight here. So there's one U.S. government, right? So if the U.S. government makes a policy, it applies to everybody. We then have 50 states. And of course, if those states make a policy, it applies to everyone within those states. But the one we often forget about, and again, I've talked a lot more about states. I mentioned some localities a little bit, but I just want to highlight here the importance of local governments. There's almost 90,000 local governments in the United States. You can see some breakdown of the different types, and they often you can actually have 2, 3 local governments that you actually respond and have to acknowledge what if you live in your county, your city. On there. So we have a lot more direct involvement with our local governments. They have a lot more control over us than our states or the federal government, even though the states and federal government usually get a lot more of our attention. So just kind of highlighting this last point as we get into this discussions in this week and the rest of the semester about state and local government. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts and discussions and finding out more about where your knowledge on government and politics is and what you're interested in learning about.